The desert wind in southern New Mexico doesn't just blow, it scours. It peels the paint off signs and the hope right out of a man's heart, leaving behind nothing but dust and silence. Out on the edge of the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead, that silence was a living thing. It could weigh a man down until he broke, or it could carve him into something as hard and weathered as the land itself. Paul Lone Mountain had been carved by it for 27 years. He was a tall man, shoulders broad from a life of fighting the earth for a living. His Apache blood showed in the copper of his skin and the straight black hair he tied back with a leather cord. His eyes were dark, steady, and held the kind of quiet that comes from seeing too much war before you're old enough to vote. He'd been just a boy, trailing Chiricahua warriors, when the last of his people laid down their arms. He learned to track, to fight, to live on roots and promises. The world had called him a warrior then. Now it just called him quiet. The government gave him a piece of land that grew more rocks than corn, but it was his. With his own 2 hands, he'd built a 2-room adobe house, raised a corral, and scraped together a small herd of sheep. Some nights, listening to the coyotes sing their lonely songs to the mountains, he felt something close to pride. But when the fire burned down to embers and the silence pressed in, the loneliness was a physical weight on his chest. He was 27 years old and had never known a woman's touch. The Apache girls he'd known were gone, married, lost to sickness, or swept away by the changing world. He could track a deer for 3 days across sun-baked stone, but the thought of speaking to a woman made his throat close up. The longing was a constant, dull ache. He was on a supply run in the dusty town of Mesilla when his only friend Thomas Orr decided to stick his nose in. Thomas was a red-haired Irishman who ran the feed store, a man who'd latched on to Paul after they'd scouted together for the army. Where other white men saw a threat, Thomas saw a brother. He saw a project. "You're getting that look, Paul," Thomas said one night, passing a whiskey jug behind the store. "A man can't wrestle sheep forever. You need a woman to keep this land from turning into your tomb." Paul stared into the fire. "There are no women," he grunted. "Not for me." Thomas's grin was a flash of white in the dark. "Then we'll fetch one." Paul frowned. "Fetch?" "Matrimonial bureaus," Thomas explained, his voice full of mischief. "Back east. You send a letter, you pay a fee, and they send you a bride on the next train. Ranchers are doing it. Miners, too. Why not an Apache warrior with a face that could scare a statue?" The idea felt foreign, wrong. "It is not our way. The world's changing, Paul. The question is, you want to die alone, or you want to take a chance?" The whiskey burned, and an image flared in Paul's mind. A woman's laughter echoing in his quiet adobe house. A partner. Maybe children. For the first time, it felt like more than a ghost of a dream. "I wouldn't know what to say," Paul admitted, his voice rough. Thomas slapped him on the back, nearly knocking him off his crate. "Lucky for you, I'm a poet." He pulled out a pen and paper. "You just tell me what you're looking for." So Paul described his dream. He spoke of a woman who was gentle, quiet, someone small, soft-spoken, who wouldn't be afraid of the long silences. Someone to keep a home, to fill the emptiness without shattering the peace he'd fought so hard to find. He wanted a partner who could move through his life like a soft breeze, not a whirlwind. Thomas's pen scratched furiously across the page. His grin got wider with every line. He sealed the envelope with a flourish, and Paul felt a strange sense of hope, a lightness he hadn't felt in years. He had placed his future in his friend's hands. But Thomas Orr was a man who loved a good joke more than he loved the truth. The letter he sent to the agency in St. Louis was a masterpiece of deception. It didn't ask for a quiet, slim woman to tend a hearth. Oh no. Thomas painted a very different portrait. "My friend Paul Lone Mountain," he wrote, "is a man of considerable means, a warrior who has carved a fortune from the desert. He seeks a woman of full figure and hearty spirit, a lady whose laughter can shake the mountains. She need not cook, clean, or sew, for he wishes only to serve her. He asks for a partner who is strong, bold, and unafraid of a fight, for his life is one of constant danger and adventure." Had Paul been able to read English, He would have broken the whiskey jug, the pen, and Thomas's head. But he couldn't. He trusted his friend. He went back to his sheep and his fences, and he began to dream of the gentle woman who would soon be on her way. He imagined her moving silently through his kitchen, her hands skilled with dough, her voice a low hum against the howl of the wind. He had no idea that the words traveling east were not a request, but bait. He couldn't know that the woman who read that letter wasn't looking for a quiet life. She was looking for an escape. He couldn't know that the woman stepping off that train would be nothing like the shadow in his mind. She would not be slim. She would not be quiet. Her name was Ruby, and she was a storm heading right for him, and she wasn't coming alone. The train station at Mesilla was just a sun-bleached platform and a shack that smelled of sweat and telegraph ink. Paul stood by the hitching post, the reins of his horse slick in his sweaty palms. His stomach was a knot of nerves tighter than any he'd felt in battle. For weeks he'd pictured this moment, a slim, shy woman stepping off the train, someone who would fit into the quiet spaces of his life. The train hissed to a stop, a monster of steam and steel. Passengers spilled out, salesmen, families, a preacher clutching his Bible. Paul scanned every face, his hope sinking with each one. None of them matched the woman in his dreams. And then, the last passenger appeared. She was not slim. The clay-colored dress she wore was straining at every seam. She was not shy. She smiled at the porter with a warmth that seemed to push back the harsh desert sun. Dark curls escaped her hat, and her skin was the color of warm honey. She carried a heavy valise in one hand and a hat box in the other, and she stepped off the train with the confidence of a queen. Then she misjudged the gap and stumbled. The hat box flew one way, the valise the other. Paul moved without thinking, his reflexes honed by years of survival. He caught both before they hit the dirt. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise, a flash of something unreadable in their depths. "Thank you," she said, her voice breathless but clear. "You're quick." Paul just stood there, holding her things, his mind a blank slate. "I am Paul Lone Mountain," he managed to say. And then, for reasons he would never understand, he added, "I am taller in the mornings." The woman blinked. A slow, confused expression crossed her face. Then she threw her head back and let out a laugh that was so loud, so full of life, it seemed to startle the dust devils into dancing. "Good to know," she boomed. "I'm Ruby Cortez." She held out a hand, and when he took it, her grip was firm, strong. Behind them, Paul heard Thomas cough to hide a snort of laughter. The knot in Paul's stomach tightened into a cold stone of dread. They loaded her things into the wagon. His horse, Smoke, a gelding usually wary of strangers, immediately nudged her hand, looking for a treat. She laughed again, that same booming sound. "Your horse is too friendly," she declared. "He needs manners." On the wagon seat, she settled with a bounce that made the whole buckboard groan in protest. "I'm heavier than I look," she said with a grin. "The wagon carries seed sacks heavier than you," Paul said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "Good," she replied, completely unfazed. "Then it will carry me just fine." They rattled through the small town. The silence in the wagon was thick and suffocating. Paul could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on them, could hear the whispers starting. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. This was not the woman he had asked for. This was a mistake, a joke. Then Ruby broke the silence, and things went from bad to worse. "Your friend's letter was very poetic," she said, her voice full of amusement. "It said you wanted a woman with a hearty laugh and a strong spirit, one who wouldn't have to bother with chores because you were a man of means who would rather do them yourself." Paul's hands tightened on the reins so hard his knuckles went white. He shot a murderous glare at Thomas, who was doing a poor job of pretending to be interested in the scenery from the wagon bed. What had he done? "Is that not what you wrote?" Ruby asked, tilting her head. She was watching him, her eyes sharp, analytical. The shame was burning in his chest now, hot and suffocating. But he was a warrior, and a warrior did not show weakness. He met her gaze. "I do not want a servant," he said, his voice flat and cold. "But I did not say that." Ruby studied his face for a long moment, a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. Then her expression softened into a small, sad smile. Good, she said quietly. I don't much like chores, but I'll do my share. As for laughter and appetite, those I have in plenty. Paul had no answer. He just stared at the road ahead, his jaw clenched, while Ruby started humming a tune beside him. He felt trapped. He had paid the fee. This woman had traveled for more than a week to get here. He couldn't just send her back, but how could he bring this loud, large, boisterous woman into his silent world? She asked questions about the ranch, the sheep, the well. He answered in clipped, one-word sentences. He was trying to push her away with his coldness, but she didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she just didn't care. When he finally grudgingly asked about her journey, her cheerful tone vanished. She spoke of a father who had lost his farm to drought and card sharks, a mother lost to fever, a home lost to the bank. I figured, she said with a shrug that didn't quite hide the pain in her eyes, if I'm going to belong somewhere, it might as well be with someone who needs me. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He almost felt a pang of sympathy, but he pushed it down. This wasn't his problem. This was Thomas's joke. I do not like jokes that make a woman feel unwanted, he said, his voice low. Ruby glanced back at Thomas, then her eyes met Paul's. Neither do I, she said. But sometimes people make jokes because they're too afraid to speak the truth. Her gaze was so direct, so knowing, it felt like she could see right through the stone walls he'd built around himself. He quickly looked away. By the time they reached his land, the sun was bleeding across the western sky. The adobe house stood against the slope, small and lonely. Ruby stepped down from the wagon and took a long look around. It's honest, she said finally. Paul just grunted. She smiled. An honest place. It tells the truth. But, she added, her eyes twinkling, it could use some curtains. He didn't know what to say to that. He busied himself with the horse as she carried her valise inside. He heard a clatter and a small curse, and he rushed in to find her on the floor, the contents of her bag spilled across the dirt-packed floor. He knelt to help her, their hands brushing as they reached for a small, leather-bound book. She snatched it away quickly, a blush rising on her cheeks. Just a diary, she said, a little too quickly. He saw something else, though. Half hidden under a pile of clothes was a small velvet bag. From it spilled a cascade of gold coins. More money than a woman whose family had lost everything should have. And tucked beside it, a small, pearl-handled Derringer pistol. Paul froze, his eyes locked on the gun, then on the money. This wasn't just the wrong woman. This wasn't just a joke gone wrong. Ruby Cortez had a secret, a dangerous one. And he had just brought that danger right to his front door. The first few days were a battle of wills fought in silence. Ruby moved through his small house like a whirlwind, knocking things over, burning the coffee, dropping plates. Each clatter, each loud laugh, was like a stone thrown into the still pond of Paul's life. He watched her, his face a mask of stone, but his mind was racing. Who was she? Where did she get that money? And why did she need a gun? She tried to make conversation, to fill the silence he cherished. He answered with grunts and nods, hoping his coldness would drive her to pack her bags and leave. But she was like a stubborn weed, refusing to be uprooted. She unpacked her things, including the velvet bag of coins and the small pistol, which she tucked under her pillow on the cot he'd set up for her in the main room. She didn't try to hide them. It was a challenge. He found her one afternoon by the corral, cleaning the Derringer with a practiced efficiency that made his blood run cold. This was not the work of a destitute farmer's daughter. You know how to use that? He asked, his voice flat. She looked up, her eyes glinting in the sun. My father taught me, she said smoothly. He said a woman alone needs to be able to protect herself. Protect herself from what? He pressed. A shadow passed over her face, so quick he almost missed it. The world is a dangerous place, she said, her voice losing its cheerful edge. She snapped the gun back together with a decisive click. The conversation was over. That Sunday, Thomas insisted on driving them into Mesilla for supplies and to see the priest. Paul felt a knot of dread in his stomach. The town was watching them. He could feel the stares, hear the whispers behind cupped hands. an Apache man, and a loud, curvy senorita. They were a spectacle. At the mercantile, Mrs. Barlow, a woman whose face was permanently soured, looked Ruby up and down with disapproval. "You'll be needing curtains, I suppose," she said, her voice dripping with scorn. "Yes," Ruby replied, her chin held high. "Something the color of a summer sky." "Do you have that?" Her confidence seemed to throw the older woman off. Mrs. Barlow simply blinked and fetched the fabric. Outside, a man lounging on a bench spat tobacco juice near Paul's feet. "Apache boy bought himself a fancy woman," he sneered. Paul's whole body went rigid. He took a step toward the man, his hand balling into a fist. But before he could, Ruby slipped her arm through his. Her touch was surprisingly steadying. "They'll get used to us," she whispered, her voice a strange mix of defiance and pleading. She was playing a part, but what was it? The priest was a small, serious man who wasted no time. "You have brought this woman here to be your wife," he stated, not asked. "The wedding can be next Sunday." The world tilted. A week? He'd imagined this arrangement would last a few uncomfortable weeks before she gave up and left. Marriage was permanent. He looked at Ruby, expecting to see panic, a way out. Instead, her eyes met his, steady and determined. "We'll be ready," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Why was she in such a hurry to tie herself to him? What was she running from that made a loveless marriage to a stranger in the middle of nowhere seem like a safe harbor? The wedding was a blur. The small adobe chapel felt hot and suffocating. Thomas stood as his witness, a guilty smirk plastered on his face. When the priest told him to kiss his bride, Paul leaned stiffly toward her cheek, but Ruby turned her head at the last second, and his lips met hers. Her lips were warm, soft, and for a heart-stopping moment, he forgot the stares, the whispers, the lies. He forgot the gun under her pillow. When she pulled away, she was smiling, but her eyes were full of a desperate, terrifying relief. That night, the house felt even smaller, the silence charged with a new, unbearable tension. They were husband and wife. He had a right to know the truth. After they had banked the fire, he turned to her. The shadows danced on her face, making her unreadable. "Who are you, Ruby?" he asked, his voice a low growl. She flinched. "I'm your wife," she whispered. "You are a stranger with a bag of gold and a gun," he shot back. "You wanted this marriage fast. Why?" She stared at the floor, her hands twisting in her lap. "I told you, my family lost everything. I had nowhere else to go." "That's not the whole truth," he said, taking a step closer. "I see it in your eyes. You're afraid of something. You're hiding." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me." She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. "I can't. It's better you don't know. It's safer for you." "Safer?" he scoffed. "You brought danger here with you. I can feel it. Was the letter a lie too? Did you write to the agency looking for a rich man to hide behind?" Her head snapped up, her eyes flashing with anger. "The letter said you were a man of means, yes, but it also said you were a warrior. It said you were brave. It said you weren't afraid of a fight." She took a deep breath, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm just asking for a place to stand, a place to start over." He wanted to press her, to demand answers, but the raw desperation in her voice stopped him. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve, a storm he couldn't predict. He was an Apache warrior who had survived battles and bloodshed, but this woman, his wife, scared him more than any enemy he had ever faced. They lay on the narrow bed that night, a foot of cold space between them. He lay awake for hours, listening to her breathing, his mind replaying every lie, every half-truth. Just before dawn, he must have drifted off. He woke with a start to the sound of floorboards creaking. Ruby was gone. He grabbed his rifle and slipped out the door into the pre-dawn chill. The moon cast long, ghostly shadows across the yard. And then he saw her, a dark shape moving toward the low ridge behind the house. She was carrying a small shovel. What was she doing? He followed her, silent as a ghost. He watched from the cover of a mesquite tree as she knelt and began to dig. After a few minutes, she pulled a small metal box from the hole. She opened it, And even in the dim light, he could see the glint of more gold, jewelry, and a stack of papers. She took out one of the papers, read it, and then carefully put everything back and reburied the box. As she stood up to leave, a piece of paper fluttered from her dress and landed on the ground unnoticed. She walked back to the house, her shoulders slumped, the weight of her secrets heavy upon her. Paul waited until she was inside, then he crept forward. He picked up the paper. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a deed. It was a wanted poster. The drawing was a crude but recognizable sketch of a man with a cruel smile. The name printed below it was Cortez, not her father, her husband. And the bounty for his capture, dead or alive, was a staggering sum. But that wasn't the part that made Paul's heart turn to ice. It was the smaller text at the bottom. Also wanted for questioning in connection with his gang's activities. His wife, Isabella Cortez, known as La Viuda, the widow, Isabella, not Ruby. His wife was a wanted woman, the widow of a notorious outlaw. The letter hadn't just been a joke. It had been a beacon. And he had just married the prize. The name Isabella Cortez echoed in the silence of Paul's mind. La Viuda, the widow. He looked from the wanted poster in his hand to the small adobe house where this woman, his wife, now slept. Everything was a lie. Her name, her story. She wasn't a destitute farmer's daughter. She was the wife of a dead outlaw, and she was hiding. Hiding from the law, or from something worse. He crumpled the poster in his fist, the anger a hot, bitter taste in his mouth. He felt like a fool. Thomas's prank had done more than saddle him with an unsuitable wife. It had made him an accomplice to a fugitive. He should ride into Messia right now, show the poster to the sheriff, and wash his hands of her. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But as he stood there in the cold desert dawn, he remembered the look in her eyes at the wedding, that desperate relief. He remembered her saying she just needed a place to stand. He was a warrior, and his instincts screamed that this was a bigger fight than just one woman running from the law. The money, the gun, the secret box, this was about survival. He went back to the house and burned the poster in the embers of the fire, watching the face of the outlaw Cortez turn to ash. He didn't know why. Maybe it was a flicker of misplaced honor. Or maybe, just maybe, he wanted to be the one to get the truth from her, not a sheriff's badge. The next few weeks were a tense, unspoken truce. He worked on the ranch from sunup to sundown, his silence a heavy cloak. Ruby, or Isabella, he didn't know what to call her in his own head, threw herself into the work of the house. She learned to cook beans without burning them, to mend his shirts with clumsy but determined stitches. She gave the sheep ridiculous names and scolded them like naughty children. The curtains she'd insisted on, a cheerful blue, now hung in the windows. They looked completely out of place in his stark, simple home, just like her. He watched her constantly, looking for cracks in her story. He noticed things. The way she always sat with her back to a wall. The way her eyes scanned the horizon whenever she stepped outside. The way she flinched at the sound of distant riders. She was living on a razor's edge, and the tension was starting to wear on both of them. The threat, when it came, was quiet at first. A stranger appeared in Messia, a tall man with a dead fish handshake and eyes that saw too much. He started asking questions at the cantina, questions about newcomers, specifically about a dark-haired woman who might have passed through. Thomas, riddled with guilt over his disastrous letter, rode out to Paul's ranch to warn him. He was asking about a woman, Paul, Thomas said, his face pale. Said he was a Pinkerton agent, looking for the widow of an outlaw named Cortez. Paul's face remained a mask of stone. And what did you tell him? I told him nothing, Thomas insisted. But Paul, people are talking. They're putting two and two together. The timing of her arrival, it's not safe. He looked at Paul, his eyes pleading. I never meant for this to happen. It was just a stupid joke. I can give you the money to send her away. Put her on a train east, somewhere he'll never find her. Send her away. It was the logical choice. It would get the danger off his land and out of his life. He could go back to his silence, his solitude. But when he looked at the house, at the ridiculous blue curtains, He felt a strange reluctance. He thought of her facing that danger alone. "She is my wife," Paul said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "She stays." Thomas stared at him dumbfounded. "Are you crazy? She lied to you. She's bringing a whole world of trouble down on your head." "Leave it be, Thomas," Paul said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The stranger in town was a sign. The storm that followed was an omen. It came out of nowhere, the sky turning a sickly yellow-brown. The wind hit like a physical blow, a wall of sand and fury. Paul was in the corral trying to calm the panicking sheep when he saw Ruby fighting to close the door to the chicken coop. The wind ripped it from her grasp, slamming her to the ground. He fought his way through the blinding dust toward her. She was on her feet again, her face streaked with grime, her skirt whipping around her legs. Instead of running for the house, she was trying to shove the last of the terrified hens back inside the coop. She was protecting his property, his animals. Together, they finally managed to force the door shut and barricade it. The roof of the house groaned under the strain of the wind. "House!" he yelled, grabbing her hand. They staggered through the storm, half blind, the sand stinging their skin. They burst through the door and slammed it shut just as the world outside seemed to explode in a roar of wind and thunder. They stood in the dim, dusty light of the house, panting, their chests heaving. Blood trickled from a cut on Ruby's forehead where the coop door had hit her. Without thinking, he reached out and gently wiped the blood away with his thumb. His touch was rough, but his gesture was tender. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. The storm had stripped away her defenses, her bravado. "Why did you stay out there?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "For a few chickens?" "They're ours," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. They sat at the table as the storm raged, the house shuddering around them. For the first time they talked, not as strangers, but as two people trapped together against a common enemy. He asked her about her real name. "Isabella," she said quietly. "My husband, his name was Marco. He wasn't a good man. He ran with a gang. They robbed banks, trains. He was handsome and charming, and I was young and foolish." She looked down at her hands. "When he was killed in a shootout, his gang thought I knew where he'd hidden the last of the money, a fortune. But I don't know. I swear it." Her voice was raw with a truth he couldn't deny. "So you ran." She nodded. "They're led by his brother, Rico. He's worse than Marco ever was. He won't stop until he finds me, or the money. I took what I could, changed my name, and answered the first letter that promised a way out. A letter about a brave warrior who wasn't afraid of a fight." A tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "I'm sorry, Paul. I've brought death to your door." He looked at her, at this woman who had faced down his coldness, the town's scorn, and a desert storm, all to protect a life that wasn't even hers. He had asked for a quiet woman, a shadow. He had been given a fighter, a survivor. "You are my wife," he said again, and this time, the words felt right. "They will have to come through me." The storm raged all night. They moved the cot closer to the fire, piling blankets against the cold that seeped through the adobe walls. When the house shuddered with a particularly violent gust of wind, her hand found his in the dark. He held it. It was a small gesture, but it was a promise, an alliance. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and battered. The yard was a mess of debris. The corral gate was bent sideways. As they stood surveying the damage, Paul saw them. Hoofprints. They were near the well, half washed away by the rain that had followed the dust. 3 riders. They had been there during the storm, watching the house, waiting. The man from town. He hadn't come alone. The storm outside was over. The one inside was just beginning. The hoofprints were a cold promise of violence. The Pinkerton agent, Rico Cortez, whoever he wasn't just asking questions anymore. He was watching. Paul felt the familiar cold tightening in his gut, the feeling he got before a fight. He spent the day repairing the storm damage, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Every shadow on the ridge, every dust devil in the distance, felt like a threat. Isabella, he started calling her that in his mind, The name Ruby felt like a costume she no longer needed, worked beside him. She said little, but her movements were charged with a nervous energy. The fear was real now, a third person living in the small adobe house with them. That night she didn't even pretend to be cheerful. She cleaned the derringer again, her movements methodical, and placed it on the small table between the bed and her cot. It was a clear statement. She would not be taken easily. "He will come back," she said, her voice a low whisper in the flickering firelight. "I know," Paul replied. He was checking his own rifle, the smooth, oiled action of familiar comfort in his hands. "You should let me go," she said, not looking at him. "This isn't your fight, Paul. I brought this here. It's my burden to carry." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. Her back was ramrod straight, but he could see the slight tremor in her hands. She was terrified, but she was still trying to protect him. This woman who had come into his life on a wave of lies was showing more honor than any he had ever known. "You are Isabella Lone Mountain now," he said, the name sounding right for the first time. "This is your home. No one will take you from it." Her shoulders slumped in relief, and a sound that was half sob, half laugh escaped her lips. The tension between them had transformed. It was no longer suspicion and awkwardness, but the taut, focused energy of two warriors preparing for battle. They didn't have to wait long. The attack came a few nights later, under the sliver of a dead moon. The dogs were the first to sound the alarm, their frantic barking cutting through the night. Paul was out of bed in an instant, rifle in hand. Isabella was right behind him, the small derringer looking like a toy in her steady grip. Through the window, they saw them. Three figures on horseback, moving slowly, deliberately toward the house. They weren't trying to be quiet. This wasn't a raid. It was an execution. "Stay inside," Paul ordered, his voice low and hard. "Like hell," she whispered back, taking up a position near the other window. A voice called out from the darkness, smooth and laced with menace. "Isabella, I know you're in there. My brother's money. Give it to me, and I'll let the Indian live." It was Rico Cortez, the man from the wanted poster, brought to life. Isabella's knuckles were white where she gripped the small pistol. "I don't have it," she shouted back, her voice shaking but defiant. "A pity," Rico's voice crooned. A shot rang out, and a bullet splintered the window frame, showering the room with glass. Paul returned fire, the blast of his rifle deafening in the small room. A man screamed outside. One down, but there were still two more. The fight was on. Gunshots echoed across the silent desert, flashes of light in the oppressive darkness. They were pinned down. Rico and his man were smart, using the corral and the rocks for cover, moving constantly. For what felt like an eternity, they exchanged fire. Paul was a skilled fighter, calm and methodical. He made every shot count. But it was Isabella who surprised him. She was a crack shot with that little pistol, firing with a deadly accuracy that spoke of a life he couldn't even imagine. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a fighter. Then he heard a new sound, the thud of hooves coming fast. From the direction of town. Was it the sheriff? Had someone heard the shots? A flicker of hope ignited in Paul's chest. But the rider wasn't the sheriff. As the figure grew clearer in the moonlight, Paul's blood ran cold. It was Thomas. And he wasn't riding to help. He was riding to join Rico's side. Thomas reined in his horse beside the two outlaws. "She's in there," he yelled, his voice strained with panic. "Just like I told you. The letter worked. Now give me what you promised me." Betrayal. It hit Paul with the force of a physical blow. Thomas, his only friend. He had done this. The letter wasn't a joke. It was a trap. He had sold them out. For what? Money? To pay a gambling debt? The reason didn't matter. The treachery cut deeper than any bullet could. Isabella saw it too. She let out a small, wounded cry. "Thomas!" Rico Cortez laughed, a sound that was pure evil. "Your friend was very helpful, Isabella. He made it all so easy." He turned to Thomas. "You'll get your money when I get mine." The knowledge of Thomas's betrayal seemed to drain the fight from them for a moment. They had been so focused on the enemy outside, they hadn't realized the deepest wound would come from a friend. And in that moment of distraction, Rico made his move. He and his man charged the house from two different directions. Paul took aim at the man, but Rico was faster. He kicked the door in, the wood splintering, and launched himself into the room. He was big, fast, and his eyes burned with a feverish greed. He lunged for Isabella. Paul swung his rifle around, using it as a club, but Rico was too close. He knocked the rifle from Paul's hands and the two men crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs and fury. Paul was strong, but Rico fought dirty, all knees and elbows. Outside, Isabella could hear Thomas shouting, his voice full of a new, horrified panic. He hadn't just been setting a trap. He'd been delivering his friends to their deaths. As Paul and Rico struggled on the floor, the other outlaw appeared in the doorway, his gun leveled at Paul's back. Isabella didn't hesitate. She fired the Derringer. The man crumpled to the ground, a look of shock on his face. The shot startled Rico, giving Paul the opening he needed. He drove his fist into Rico's jaw, a solid, cracking blow. Rico staggered back, shaking his head to clear it. He pulled a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt. "The money, Isabella," he snarled, advancing on her. "Tell me where it is, or I'll cut your new husband to pieces." Paul scrambled for his rifle, but it was too far away. Rico was between him and Isabella. He was trapped. And then something unbelievable happened. Thomas Orr appeared in the shattered doorway, his face a mask of terror and regret. He was holding an old rusty pistol. "Leave them alone, Rico," he yelled, his voice cracking. Rico laughed. "Get out of here, you drunken fool. This doesn't concern you." "I brought them into this," Thomas said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I'm taking them out of it." He fired the pistol. The shot went wide, but it was enough of a distraction. Paul launched himself at Rico, tackling him around the waist. The knife clattered to the floor. As they wrestled, Rico's hand scrabbled for his own gun. He was stronger than Paul, his muscles fueled by rage and desperation. He was slowly, surely winning. He pressed the barrel of his gun into Paul's side. A final shot rang out. Rico's body went stiff. The crazed light in his eyes flickered and died. He slumped forward, a dead weight on top of Paul. Behind him, Isabella stood, the Derringer smoking in her hand. Her face was pale, but her hand was steady. Paul pushed the body off him and staggered to his feet. He looked at Isabella, at the body of Rico Cortez, at the other dead outlaw. Then he looked at the doorway, where Thomas stood, his face ashen, the rusty pistol hanging limply in his hand. The fight was over. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier, more profound than any Paul had ever known. It was the silence of death, the silence of betrayal, the silence of a life that could never go back to what it was. The silence in the aftermath was a thick, ringing thing, broken only by the whimpering of the dogs outside and the ragged sound of their own breathing. Paul looked at the two dead men on his floor, then at Thomas, who was leaning against the doorframe, shaking like a leaf. The betrayal was a raw, open wound. "Why, Thomas?" Paul's voice was quiet, but it held the cold weight of a death sentence. Tears streamed down Thomas's face, cutting clean tracks through the grime. "Debts," he choked out. "I owed them. Rico found me. He knew I was your friend. He said if I helped him find Isabella, he'd wipe the slate clean. He swore no one would get hurt. He just wanted the money." He looked from Paul to Isabella, his eyes begging for an absolution he didn't deserve. I swear, Paul, I never thought he'd try to kill you." Isabella stepped forward, her face hard. "You sent that letter," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "The part about him being a man of means, a warrior. You wrote that for Rico, didn't you? So he'd know Paul would be a target or a protector worth finding." Thomas couldn't meet her gaze. He just nodded, his body racked with sobs. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God, I'm so sorry." Paul walked over to his friend. For a moment it looked like he might strike him, end him right there. But instead he simply took the rusty pistol from Thomas's limp hand. "Get out," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Get on your horse and ride. If I ever see your face in Messia again, I will kill you." Thomas stumbled out into the darkness without another word. The sound of his horse galloping away was the sound of a 15-year friendship dying. Paul turned back to Isabella. They stood there, surrounded by the carnage, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. He looked at her, this woman of secrets and storms. and he felt a profound, aching sense of connection. They were survivors. They had faced death together. "The box," he said quietly, "the one you buried, is the money in it?" She nodded, her eyes welling with fresh tears. "Yes, all of it. Marco's last score. I never wanted it. It's cursed." They worked together through the rest of the night, their movements efficient and synchronized. They dragged the bodies outside. They cleaned the blood from the floorboards. They righted the furniture. By dawn, the house was clean, but the ghosts of the night's violence remained. As the sun rose, casting a clean, golden light over the battered ranch, Paul went out to the ridge and dug up the metal box. He brought it back and set it on the table between them. Isabella opened it. It was full of cash, jewelry, and gold coins. A fortune, enough to start a new life anywhere. "It's yours," she said, pushing the box toward him. "For everything. For saving my life. Take it and I'll go. I'll disappear. No one will ever have to know I was here." He looked at the money, then he looked at her. He thought of his life before she came. The crushing silence. The suffocating loneliness. He had asked for a quiet life. A gentle partner. He had thought that was what he wanted. But he was wrong. The silence wasn't peace. It was emptiness. Isabella, with all her chaos and danger, had filled that emptiness with life. She had shown him what it meant to fight for something, to fight for someone. "I don't want the money," he said. He reached across the table and took her hand. Her skin was cold, but her grip was strong. "I want you." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and a fragile, dawning hope. "But all the lies," she whispered, "the trouble I brought." "You brought life," he corrected her gently. "I was a man half buried in silence. You woke me up." He squeezed her hand. "We can take this money to the law. Tell them the truth. What happens, happens. Or we can use it to build something here. Together. A new life. No more running." Her answer wasn't in words. It was in the single perfect tear that rolled down her cheek and the way her fingers intertwined with his. It was a choice. A beginning. Forged in blood and betrayal, but real and true. They took the bodies into the desert and buried them deep, leaving no markers. They told the sheriff in Mesilla that Rico and his men had come looking for water and trouble, and that they had gotten what they deserved. The sheriff, a practical man who knew better than to question a story that solved a problem, was happy to close the case. Thomas Orr was never seen in Mesilla again. The money from the box was a secret they kept between them. They used it, piece by piece, to rebuild and expand the ranch. They bought more land, a better breed of sheep, a strong new stallion. The small adobe house grew, room by room, and with it, their family grew. They adopted an orphaned Apache boy from the reservation, a boy with haunted eyes who slowly learned to laugh again under Isabella's care. Then came a daughter of their own, a girl with Paul's quiet eyes and Isabella's booming laugh. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the noise of life. Laughter, arguments, songs from Isabella's old guitar, and the clumsy three-note lullaby that Paul would sing to his children at night. Years passed. The silver of age began to thread Paul's black hair, and laugh lines crinkled around Isabella's eyes. Their story became a local legend, a tale told around campfires, growing more mythic with each telling. Some said the ghost of Rico Cortez still haunted the Jornada, looking for his lost treasure. But the people who knew Paul and Isabella knew the real treasure wasn't buried in the desert. It was right there, on the porch of the adobe house that love had built. One evening, as they sat on that porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and purple, Isabella leaned her head on his shoulder. Their children were grown. Their life was full. "Do you ever think about that letter?" she asked, her voice soft with amusement. Paul groaned. "Thomas's ridiculous letter. The man of means." She laughed. "It was the biggest lie I ever heard, and the best thing that ever happened to me." He pulled her closer, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of her hair. "He thought he was setting a trap, but he just led you home." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the vast velvet sky. The desert wind whispered through the mesquite, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like a song. He had been a man who wished for a quiet shadow, and fate, in its infinite and cruel wisdom, had sent him a storm. A beautiful, fierce, life-giving storm, and he wouldn't have had it any other way. Thank you for staying with me through this incredible journey. If you enjoyed this story of love, betrayal, and survival, please show your support by hitting that like button. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more stories that explore the wild and unpredictable corners of the human heart.